Hello, welcome. Gluttony rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with loud declarations or sudden catastrophic choices. It comes the way most slow and quiet destructions come, gently, reasonably, one small indulgence at a time. An extra portion when the first was already enough. Another helping of comfort at the end of a long day. A little more of something pleasant simply because it feels good, and the line between enough and too much is so easy to cross without noticing you are crossing it. This is what makes gluttony one of the more deceptive struggles of the human heart. It wears the clothing of ordinary life so convincingly that it can be practiced for years without ever being named. We do not call it excess while we are in the middle of it. We call it comfort. We call it reward. We call it simply the way things are. And we keep reaching for the thing that promises to fill the particular emptiness we are carrying, surprised each time that it falls a little shorter than we hoped. The promise is always the same. This time it will satisfy. And the result is always the same. It doesn't. Not fully. Not lastingly. The satisfaction is real, but brief. And that brief moment of relief is just enough to send us reaching again, looking for the same comfort in the same place, wondering why it never quite fills what we were hoping it would. They had seen things no people before them had ever seen. They had watched the Nile run red. They had stood dry-footed between walls of water while the sea held itself apart for them and then came crashing down on the army that had pursued them. They had seen fire by night and cloud by day, and they had walked toward both as though following someone who knew exactly where they were going. Because they were. They had been led out of 400 years of slavery by the hand of a God who had heard their groaning, remembered his covenant, and come down to do something about it. And now they were hungry. And the memory of Egypt was beginning to look different than it had the day they left. This is how it often works. Hunger rewrites history. The mind that is empty, tired, and uncertain about tomorrow reaches backward for something it can hold. What it finds is not the whole truth of the past, but a carefully edited version. The pleasures without the suffering, the food without the whip, the fish and cucumbers and melons and leeks without the bricks, the labor, and the children thrown into the Nile. Their nostalgia for Egypt was not truly a longing for slavery. It was a longing for certainty, for the known quantity of a life that, however terrible, at least came with the knowledge of what tomorrow would look like. The wilderness offered no such knowledge. It offered only the next step and the promise of the God who had led them to it. And the people were not sure that was enough. It began with grumbling, not yet open rebellion, not yet organized resistance, just the low, persistent sound of a people who were frightened, tired, and had begun to voice what fear sounds like when it has run out of patience with silence. If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt, they said. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve us to death. Moses and Aaron heard their words. God heard them too. What God heard was more than a complaint about food. It was a theological verdict, the conclusion of a people who had witnessed miracle after miracle and were now, in the absence of visible provision, beginning to revise their understanding of his character. The deeper message beneath their grumbling was this: Perhaps He does not actually care for us. Perhaps He brought us out here not to give us something, but to take away the last thing we had. Perhaps Egypt, for all its cruelty, was more reliable than this God who leads us into the wilderness without telling us where the next meal is coming from. This is the deeper anatomy of grumbling. It is almost never really about the surface complaint. It is about trust. It is about whether God can be believed in the gap between the last miracle and the next provision. In the ordinary days when the sea is not parting, the fire is not falling, and all you have is a promise, an empty stomach, and the memory of what used to fill it. God's response to the people's complaint was not the answer they deserved. It was the answer they needed. He spoke to Moses with a patience that should have been astonishing after everything he had just heard. I will rain down bread from heaven for you. Not a scolding, not a withdrawal of His presence, not the punishment the grumbling might have earned, simply bread, daily, from heaven, beginning tomorrow. He added an instruction that was itself a lesson. They were to go out each morning and gather only what they needed for that day. No saving for tomorrow, no stockpiling, no building a reserve against the uncertainty of the future. Each morning would bring its own provision, and the provision of each morning was to be received, consumed, and trusted to return the next day. This was not merely a logistical instruction, it was a daily curriculum, a repeated exercise in the exact posture of heart God was forming in His people: dependence, trust, the willingness to receive today's gift without demanding tomorrow's guarantee in advance. The next morning, when the dew that had settled overnight had lifted from the ground, the people came out of their tents and found something they had never seen before. A fine, flaky substance, white like coriander seed, covering the ground the way frost covers the ground, delicate, abundant, everywhere. They looked at one another with the particular expression of people encountering something entirely outside their categories of experience. "What is it?" they asked. The question itself became its name, Manna. What is it? Moses told them, "It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat." It tasted like wafers made with honey. It was sufficient. When they gathered it and measured it, something remarkable happened. Those who had gathered more than they needed had no surplus, and those who had gathered less had no lack. Everyone had exactly enough. The provision calibrated itself to the need, as though the manna already knew what each person required and had arrived in precisely that amount, no more and no less. Some of the people tested the boundary almost immediately. They gathered more than they needed and tried to keep it overnight, hoping to secure themselves against the possibility that tomorrow's supply might not come. In the morning, they found it full of maggots and beginning to rot. The extra they had tried to hold on to against tomorrow had become inedible by the very act of trying to hold on to it. The lesson was direct and impossible to ignore. Tomorrow's provision could not be hoarded into today. The gift was designed to require daily return, daily trust, and daily willingness to come out in the morning and receive rather than rely on what yesterday's effort had accumulated. God was not simply feeding His people, He was teaching them something about who He was, that He could be trusted to provide again, that the faithfulness of yesterday's morning was a reliable promise about tomorrow's morning, that a God who rained bread from heaven once would do it again. On the sixth day he gave them double, enough for the sixth day and the Sabbath, the day of rest on which no manna would appear. When some of the people went out on the seventh day, out of habit or anxiety, and found nothing, God's question came through Moses with a weariness that was also a form of love. How long will these people refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Everyone is to stay where they are on the seventh day. Even the rhythm of provision was a teaching. Work and rest, gathering and ceasing. The daily miracle was punctuated by a weekly reminder that the God who provided had also rested and called his people to rest. That human life was not designed for relentless accumulation, but for the alternating rhythm of labor and trust, and the particular peace of a day given entirely to the one who provided all the others. The manna continued for 40 years. Every morning for 4 decades it appeared with the dew, delicate and white, covering the ground. Every day it sustained them, tasting like wafers made with honey. Every evening it disappeared with the heat of the day, only to return again the next morning without fail. 40 years of daily bread from heaven, 40 years of exact provision, 40 years of the same patient generosity from a God whose people never quite stopped being surprised that he showed up. And still, they wanted something else. We never see anything but this manna, they said. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt, the cucumbers and the melons, the leeks and the onions and the garlic. There is nothing here but this manna. They were eating food that fell from heaven every morning, provided by the hand of God in exactly the amount they needed. It was not enough. This is the testimony the manna offers about the human heart, that it is capable of receiving daily miracles and still craving what it does not have, still comparing the gift to an imagined alternative and finding the gift insufficient, still looking at the bread that fell from heaven and calling it unsatisfying because it is not something else. The people were not wrong to want more. The longing for more is woven into the human soul by a God who made us for a fullness that nothing in the wilderness could ultimately provide. They were wrong only about where that fullness was to be found. The manna was never meant to be the final answer to hunger. It was always a signpost, a daily embodied lesson about the God who provides, a 40-year apprenticeship in trust, a quiet preparation of the heart for something that would come much later, in a different wilderness, when a different voice would say, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." The manna pointed forward to that voice, and the hunger it could not fully satisfy was always meant to be satisfied there. The events surrounding the manna took place during one of the most significant transitional periods in all of human history, the 40-year wilderness journey of the Israelites following their deliverance from Egypt, around 1446 to 1406 BC. To truly understand what the manna meant, you must first understand what the wilderness was and what the people had left behind to enter it. Egypt was, for all its cruelty, a place of predictable rhythms. The Nile flooded on schedule. The harvests followed the floods. The food was abundant and varied. Fish pulled fresh from the river, vegetables grown in the fertile delta soil. the cucumbers and melons and leeks and onions and garlic that the people would later remember with an ache of longing. The Israelites had been slaves, brutalized and broken, their children threatened, and their labor extracted without compensation. But they had eaten. They had known what tomorrow looked like. They had lived inside a system, oppressive and dehumanizing, yes, but comprehensible, predictable, and stocked with the particular comfort that familiarity provides, even when familiarity is its own kind of prison. The wilderness offered none of this. It was hot and dry and largely barren, a harsh landscape that provided nothing on its own terms for the survival of a population estimated in the hundreds of thousands. There were no fields to plant, no river to fish, no market to visit, no supply chain stretching back to a stocked pantry. There was only the next step and the God who had led them to it, and between those two things, nothing but the faith that was precisely what the wilderness had been designed to form in them. This is the context into which the manna fell. It was not merely a logistical solution to a food problem. It was a theological education delivered in food form every morning for 40 years to a people who had much to learn about the God who had set them free. The manna itself was genuinely unprecedented, something the Israelites had never seen and for which they had no category. This is why their first response was simply a question: what is it? It appeared each morning with the dew, delicate and flaky and white, covering the ground like frost before the sun grew hot enough to melt it away. It tasted of honey. It could be ground and baked into bread. It sustained hundreds of thousands of people through 4 decades in a landscape that could not have fed them by any natural means. But the miracle was not only in the substance, it was in the structure of how it was given. The instruction to gather only what was needed for each day was not arbitrary. It was the curriculum itself, a daily, embodied exercise in the specific kind of trust that the wilderness was meant to produce. To gather only enough for today required believing that tomorrow's supply would arrive. It required living in the present provision rather than anxiously securing the future against the possibility of God's faithfulness running out. The person who gathered extra and tried to keep it overnight discovered by morning that it had spoiled, as though the manna itself was designed to resist being turned into security against tomorrow, to make accumulation not merely unnecessary but impossible. God was not simply providing food, He was dismantling the Egypt-shaped patterns of a people who had been formed by scarcity and oppression. He was teaching them to receive daily gift without grasping, to trust tomorrow's provision without hoarding today's, and to live in the open-handed posture of those who have learned that their God is reliably faithful. The Sabbath provision deepened the lesson. On the 6th day, double manna appeared, enough for both the 6th and 7th days. On the 7th, nothing fell. The rhythm was built into the miracle itself: work and rest, gathering and ceasing, 6 days of effort followed by 1 day of deliberate dependence and worship. The people who went out on the 7th day looking for manna found nothing and heard the question that came back through Moses: "How long will you refuse to keep my commands?" Which was really asking something more personal. How long before you trust me enough to rest? The manna narrative is one of Scripture's richest provisions, layered with meanings that reach far beyond its immediate context. First and most simply, it demonstrated that God provides, not eventually, not in vague generalities, but daily, specifically, in exactly the amount each person required. The God who led his people into a place where they could not feed themselves was the same God who fed them there, making the helplessness of the wilderness not a failure of his leadership, but the very occasion for the demonstration of his faithfulness. He had not brought them out to abandon them. He had brought them out to teach them what provision looks like when it comes from him rather than from Egypt. It exposed, with uncomfortable precision, the human tendency toward discontent, even in the presence of miracles. The people who had watched the sea divide were, within weeks, weeping for Egyptian vegetables. The people who ate honey-flavored bread from heaven were, within months, describing their situation as having nothing to look at but this manna. This is not a peculiarity of the ancient Israelites. It is a portrait of the human heart in its natural condition, capable of receiving extraordinary grace and still finding it insufficient, still measuring the gift against the craving and concluding that the craving is larger. The manna was also a signpost pointing beyond itself. Centuries later, when Jesus stood in a synagogue and declared, "I am the bread of life, whoever comes to me will never go hungry," he was drawing a direct line from the wilderness to himself. The crowd he was addressing had just witnessed the feeding of 5,000 and wanted more bread. He redirected their hunger. "Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which anyone may eat and not die." The manna had sustained physical life for 40 years. The bread he offered sustained something deeper than physical life, permanently, without the daily return to gather and the daily risk of finding nothing if you reached for more than you needed. The manna was always pointing to him, the true bread, the final and complete answer to the hunger that honey wafers falling from heaven could address but never ultimately satisfy. Perhaps the most theologically significant detail in the entire manna narrative is not the miracle itself, but the duration of it. 40 years. Through grumbling and rebellion, and golden calves and craving, and the longing for Egypt that never quite left. 40 years of morning provision, 40 years of the same faithful appearance of bread on the ground, 40 years of a God who could have been justified in withdrawing the gift from a people so consistently ungrateful for it, and chose instead to keep giving it. This is the long-suffering love of God made visible in food form. He did not abandon them. He did not reduce the provision in proportion to their gratitude. He fed them fully, daily, faithfully, while slowly and patiently doing the longer work of forming in them the trust and the worship and the dependence that the wilderness was always meant to produce. The manna was provision. It was also for 40 years a daily act of mercy toward a people who had not yet learned to deserve it, which is to say, toward people exactly like us. The Israelites had not been free for long before the grumbling started. This is worth sitting with, because the timing matters. They had witnessed the plagues, 10 of them, each one more devastating than the last, each one a demonstration of the power of the God who had sent Moses to them. They had stood in their doorways on the Passover night with blood on the doorposts and watched death move through Egypt and pass over them. They had walked through the sea on dry ground with walls of water on either side and watched those walls collapse behind them on the army that had pursued them. They had been free for weeks, and already they were remembering Egypt with longing. This is not a puzzle about ancient Israelite ingratitude. It is a precise portrait of how the human mind operates under stress. Hunger and uncertainty do not merely make us uncomfortable, they actively distort our perception of the past. The mind that is empty and frightened reaches backward for something solid to hold, and what it retrieves is not the full truth of what was, but a carefully curated version. The pleasures extracted from their context, the comforts lifted out from the suffering that surrounded them. They remembered the meat and the fish and the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the garlic. They did not remember the quotas and the whips and the children thrown into the Nile. Nostalgia had edited the record, and what remained was a golden version of Egypt that had never quite existed, more satisfying in memory than it had ever been in reality. This is one of the core psychological mechanisms behind chronic discontent. We do not compare our present reality to an accurate accounting of the past. We compare it to an idealized version, and the idealized version always wins. The result is a present that perpetually disappoints, a now that can never compete with the carefully preserved memory of a then that was never quite as good as we remember it being. What the Israelites were expressing when they wept for the food of Egypt was not primarily a complaint about food. It was an anxiety complaint, wearing food's clothing. The wilderness offered no certainty. There was no way to plan ahead, no way to stock up, no visible infrastructure that guaranteed tomorrow's needs. The daily bread from heaven was genuinely miraculous, but it was only daily. It required them to wake up every morning and trust that what had appeared yesterday would appear again today, and to make peace with the fact that they could not know this in advance, could not secure it, could not hold it in their hands the night before as evidence that tomorrow would be all right. This is precisely the kind of uncertainty that drives people toward excess. When the future feels uncontrollable, the instinct is to compensate in the present, to consume more now against the possibility that less will be available later, to find in the tangible comfort of food or drink or familiar pleasure a temporary anchor in the anxiety of the unknown. The Israelites' craving for Egypt was not really about food. It was about the desire for a life whose contours they could predict, a familiar rhythm that told them what tomorrow would look like, even if tomorrow was terrible. Known suffering had begun to feel safer than unknown freedom. The hoarding that followed the manna's arrival expressed the same anxiety more directly. Those who gathered extra and stored it overnight, despite explicit instruction not to, found it spoiled by morning. The act of hoarding had not secured them. It had simply turned God's good gift into something rotten. Anxiety about tomorrow, expressed through the accumulation of more than today required, produced exactly the outcome it was trying to prevent: lack. What they had clutched too tightly turned in their hands. The specific foods have changed. The wilderness has been replaced by abundance so staggering the Israelites could not have imagined it. But the dynamics operating in that desert are the same dynamics operating in the human heart today. The comparison that makes ordinary gifts feel like scarcity. The anxiety that reaches for more than enough in hopes of securing a feeling of safety. The emotional hunger that presents itself as physical hunger and then discovers after eating that it is still there. Gluttony in its fullest sense is rarely only about food. It is the broader reaching of the soul toward something tangible when the intangible thing it actually needs feels inaccessible. We eat when we are lonely. We consume when we are bored. We reach for the familiar comfort of excess when we are anxious or grieving, or simply unable to sit with the uncertainty of a moment that offers no guarantee about the next one. The pattern is old. It was visible in the wilderness of Sinai, and it is visible in the ordinary kitchens and quiet evenings of our own lives. The path forward is the same one God was trying to teach in the wilderness. Not the accumulation of more, but the practice of trust, not the anxious hoarding of today's comfort against tomorrow's uncertainty, but the daily, open-handed receiving of exactly what is given, with gratitude for the God who gave it, and faith that He will give again. True satisfaction, the kind that doesn't require a second helping to maintain itself, does not come from filling the emptiness with more. It comes from bringing the emptiness honestly to the one who designed it for Himself, and discovering that He is, after all, enough. The Israelites' discontent with the manna was not a harmless venting of frustration. It was a posture of heart that carried real and lasting consequences for their leaders, their community, their relationship with God, and the entire trajectory of their journey. Moses bore the weight of it most visibly. The constant complaint of hundreds of thousands of people pressed down on him until he cried out to God that the burden was more than he could carry alone. I cannot carry all these people by myself. The burden is too heavy for me. The grumbling that had seemed like a simple expression of hunger had become something that threatened to break the man God had appointed to lead them. Leadership is always affected by the spirit of those being led, and a community shaped by complaint creates a particular kind of exhaustion in the people responsible for its well-being. The community itself was fractured by the pattern. Instead of the shared gratitude of a people who had been delivered together, there was the shared resentment of people who had decided that what they had been given was insufficient. Gratitude binds communities. Chronic discontent divides them, creating an atmosphere in which no gift is ever quite enough and no provision is ever worthy of thanks. Spiritually, the damage was perhaps most serious. The grumbling was not merely a complaint about food, it was a running verdict about the character of God. Every cry for the food of Egypt was an implicit declaration that Egypt had been more reliable than he was, that slavery had offered more security than his daily provision in freedom. The distance this created between the people and God was not his doing. He continued to provide. He continued to lead. He continued to speak. But a heart that interprets miraculous daily provision as insufficient cannot receive what is being given. It is too busy cataloging what is missing. The consequences extended beyond the wilderness generation. Their pattern of craving and complaint became a permanent warning woven into Israel's collective memory, rehearsed in the Psalms, referenced by Paul, cited by Jesus. The story of a people who ate bread from heaven and called it nothing, held up in every generation as a mirror to the human heart's remarkable capacity to receive extraordinary grace and still reach for something else. The harm that gluttony and excess produce in our own lives follows the same pattern, expressed through different circumstances. Physically, the body bears the cost of what the heart refuses to address through honest means. What begins as comfort eating, the extra portion at the end of a hard day, the reaching for something sweet when something difficult needs to be felt, accumulates over time into patterns that damage health, diminish energy, and create a complicated relationship with the body that God designed for flourishing. The attempt to soothe emotional pain through physical consumption does not heal the pain. It layers physical consequences on top of emotional ones and leaves both unresolved. The spiritual cost is subtler but more lasting. Excess in any form trains the attention away from God and toward the thing being consumed, and attention, over time, becomes worship. What we reach for habitually in our emptiness becomes, functionally, what we trust for our fullness. Gluttony does not merely add weight to the body, it adds distance to the soul's relationship with the one whose provision it has decided is insufficient. And as with the Israelites, the damage rarely stays contained to the individual. The restlessness that excess produces, the cycle of craving and consumption and guilt and craving again, shapes how we are present in our relationships, how available we are to the people who need us, how honestly we live in our own skin. The person numbing emotional pain through chronic excess is not fully present anywhere, because part of them is always somewhere else, reaching for the next thing that will briefly quiet what hasn't been brought to God. The Manna narrative does not hide any of this. It shows the cost plainly, the wearied leader, the fractured community, the hearts still facing Egypt when they should have been facing forward, the wandering that stretched on longer than it needed to because a people would not learn to receive what was given and trust the one who was giving it. God's provision was not the problem. It never is. The problem was a heart that had decided, even in the presence of daily miracles, that what it had was not enough, and had not yet learned to bring that conviction honestly to the only one capable of answering it. The manna kept falling. Through the grumbling and the weeping and the longing for Egypt, through the hoarding and the Sabbath violations and the seasons when the people's hearts were turned entirely away from the God who was feeding them, the manna kept falling. Every morning for 40 years, without a single exception, without reduction in proportion to the gratitude received, without the withdrawal that the repeated ingratitude might have justified, the bread appeared with the dew and covered the ground and waited to be gathered. This is the first and most foundational transformation the story offers, not a change in the people, at least not immediately, but a revelation of the character of the God who kept providing while the change was slow in coming. His faithfulness was not conditional on their responsiveness. His patience did not have a limit visible anywhere in the 40-year record. He met their craving with continued provision, their grumbling with continued presence, their longing for Egypt with continued leadership towards something better. as though he had decided at the beginning that he would see this through regardless of what the journey required of his forbearance. The transformation in the people was gradual and uneven, as genuine transformation always is. Some learned to gather only what was needed and discovered that it was, in fact, enough. Some learned to rest on the seventh day and found in that rest something they had not expected, the particular piece of a day given entirely to trust rather than effort. Some began to understand that the daily return to gather was not a burden but an invitation, a daily renewal of the relationship between a providing God and a dependent people, a morning practice of the posture that the wilderness was always trying to form in them. The manna that had seemed like a limitation began, for some, to look like what it actually was, a gift. The manna sustained the Israelites for 40 years. It could not satisfy them completely because it was never designed to be the final answer. It was always a signpost. When Jesus stood before a crowd that had just been fed miraculously and wanted more bread, he redirected their hunger with words that reached all the way back to the wilderness. I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. The manna had addressed physical hunger daily for 4 decades. What he was offering addressed the deeper hunger, the one that the manna could temporarily quiet but never finally satisfy, the one that had been driving the craving for Egypt all along without the people quite understanding what they were actually hungry for. The true bread had arrived, not falling from the sky each morning to be gathered before the heat of the day, not subject to spoiling if held too long, not requiring daily return to the same ground to be gathered again, but given once, completely, in a life and a death and a resurrection that provided what no manna could, not just the sustenance of the body for another day, but the satisfaction of the soul for eternity. The Apostle Paul wrote from a prison cell words that would have seemed incomprehensible to the Israelites weeping at the entrance of their tents. I have learned, in whatever state I am, to be content. Learned, past tense, through a process, across seasons of abundance and seasons of profound need, a contentment that was not natural to him and did not arrive all at once, but was formed in him through the same kind of repeated, daily, unglamorous practice that the manna was trying to form in Israel. This contentment is the fruit of transformation, and it grows from a single root, the discovery that God is actually and experientially sufficient. Not theoretically sufficient, not sufficient in principle, but sufficient in the specific hunger of the specific moment, able to meet what no amount of excess has ever been able to meet, able to satisfy what every second helping has left still wanting. For us today, the path is the same one the wilderness was always offering. Bring the craving honestly to God, rather than feeding it with more of what has never quite been enough. Receive today's provision with gratitude, rather than reaching past it toward what tomorrow might hold. Practice the open-handed trust that the manna was designed to produce, the daily acknowledgement that we are dependent, that dependence is not a problem to be solved through accumulation, and that the God who provided yesterday will provide again. The restlessness that excess produces, the cycle of craving and consuming and guilt and craving again, is broken not by greater willpower, but by greater satisfaction. And greater satisfaction is found not in more of what has always left us empty, but in the bread that came down from heaven and declared that whoever comes to him will never go hungry again. The first and most important step is the one the Israelites were never willing to take: honest acknowledgement of what is actually happening in the heart beneath the craving. Before reaching for the extra portion, pause long enough to ask a simple question. What am I actually hungry for right now? Physical hunger is real and legitimate and deserves to be fed. But much of what drives excess is something other than physical hunger. Loneliness looking for company, anxiety looking for an anchor, boredom looking for stimulation, grief looking for comfort. Naming the actual need does not make it disappear, but it stops the cycle of feeding a spiritual or emotional hunger with something physical that will never reach the place where the hunger actually lives. Bring what you find to God honestly, not with shame. Shame drives the behavior deeper and makes confession feel impossible. With the same directness that David brought to Psalm 51, the same open acknowledgement that does not minimize or excuse, but simply says, "This is what is happening in me, and I cannot fix it from the inside." The Israelites, who learned to gather only what they needed for each day, had not simply become stronger-willed than those who hoarded. They had learned a new practice, and practice, repeated enough times, becomes the natural response. Identify the specific patterns that consistently lead to excess in your own life. The late evening alone with a screen. The particular kind of stress that sends you to the kitchen. The social situation that produces mindless eating. Name them specifically, not generally. Then build a pre-planned response into each pattern, not a prohibition, but a replacement. A walk instead of a second portion. A phone call to someone trusted instead of the pantry. A prayer spoken aloud in the moment the craving arrives, rather than a silent negotiation that the craving usually wins. Practice eating with gratitude and intention, beginning meals with genuine thanks, eating slowly enough to actually taste what God has provided, stopping at sufficiency rather than at fullness. These are not dietary tips. They are spiritual practices that train the heart to receive today's provision as enough. The wilderness was not walked alone, and neither is this. Find one trusted person with whom you can be honest about the patterns you are trying to change. Not for accountability in the punitive sense, but for the simple, profound power of being known by someone who will not recoil from what you tell them and will pray with you for what you cannot yet sustain alone. James 5:16 is not only for dramatic sins, it is for the quiet, repetitive, ordinary struggles that thrive in secrecy and weaken in the light of honest relationship. Name it to someone. Let them pray. Let the burden of carrying it alone be lifted by the grace that flows through honest community. The most important long-term practice is the simplest and the hardest, learning to bring your emptiness to God before you bring it to the kitchen. This means developing a prayer life honest enough to say, "I am lonely," or "I am anxious," or "I am bored, and I do not know what to do with myself." and then waiting in that honesty long enough to receive what God actually offers, rather than immediately filling the space with something else. It means investing in the relationships and purposes and worship that address the soul's actual needs, rather than managing the symptoms of their absence through consumption. The contentment Paul described, learned, practiced, real, is available. It grows slowly in the ordinary soil of daily honesty and daily return to the God whose provision is, in the end, the only thing that reaches all the way down to where the hunger actually lives. He is enough. Practice believing it, one day, one meal, one honest prayer at a time. As this story of the manna and the wilderness gently comes to an end, let its truths settle quietly into your heart tonight. For 40 years, God fed his people in a place that could not feed them. Morning after morning, without fail, without reduction, without the withdrawal that their grumbling might have justified. Bread appeared on the ground with the dew, sweet and sufficient and utterly unearned. He provided for people who were complaining about his provision. He fed people who were longing for the food of a place that had enslaved them. He kept teaching a lesson to people who were slow to learn it, and he did not stop until the lesson had been given every opportunity to take root. This is who he is. And this is the God who meets you in your own wilderness tonight, in the patterns of excess that have become familiar, in the craving that returns before the last one has fully faded, in the hunger that goes deeper than anything on any table has ever reached. He sees beneath the reaching. He knows what you are actually hungry for. And he offers what no amount of accumulation has ever managed to provide: the true bread, the lasting satisfaction, the quiet fullness of a soul that has stopped looking for what only he can give in the places where he cannot be found. Whatever has had too much of your appetite, whatever pattern of craving or comfort or excess has quietly taken more than its share of your heart, you can bring it to him tonight, not with shame, with honesty, with the open hands of someone who has finally stopped hoarding what was never going to be enough anyway. He is not waiting to condemn you. He is waiting to feed you with the presence and the love and the daily sufficiency that the manna was always pointing toward and never quite the whole of. Rest now in his care. You are seen in your hunger. You are known in your craving. You are loved past what your worst patterns have made of you. And in him, only in him, you will find the contentment your heart has been searching for in all the wrong places. The bread of heaven is here. Come and eat. Sleep peacefully. Amen.